Well, good morning and welcome to everyone. I'm Brooks Rayford, president of the North Carolina Technology Association, or NCTech. And I want to welcome you to this special session today that is an outgrowth of a series of polls that we conducted last April, May, and June regarding the COVID impact on business. We also asked things like, when do you anticipate gatherings will be permitted again? And when do you expect an economic rebound to occur, and what form might that take, and a few other sort of prediction-oriented questions. We published those poll results twice monthly, which showed how sentiment shifted over those 3 months of time. And it got a lot of media coverage, of course, was of great interest to our members. And so when the COVID vaccine approvals were announced late last year and the rollout began, we saw a quick boost in business and consumer confidence. In fact, at NCTech, we had a record-setting first quarter in terms of membership growth. Our sponsorship commitments also spiked, and we began getting inquiries from the media and our members about things like business sentiment, return to office policies, and so forth. So we crafted a three-part series of activities to address all of that. A few weeks ago, I convened a group of CEOs of North Carolina headquartered tech companies, as well as site leaders of some of the large tech hubs in the state of non-headquartered companies. So for example, Credit Karma, who's on our panel today, or IBM, Cisco, companies of that nature that have large tech hubs here, even if they are not headquartered here, and in some cases are not themselves tech companies. So this was an opportunity for them to share with each other how they were approaching the future of not only the workplace, but also the way work is done. And following that session, the next step was to go out to a larger group of tech CEOs and site leaders with a poll that asked questions about not just return to office, but also trends in business, hiring, and so forth. And that poll was conducted late last week. So the third step was to host this session today, where we will brief you on the poll results and engage a panel in discussion around these issues. We actually updated the title of today's session a few weeks ago, if you noticed. I'm not sure how many of you registered early, but you may have seen that change. I was visiting with a friend who's a local business leader, and she mentioned that she had heard of a large employer in the area that was using the term work forward as opposed to return to office, because we're not really returning to the pre-COVID status quo. Instead, we're adapting and shifting to incorporate a blend of old and new approaches. So it's really more fitting to describe this topic as work forward. So there we are. Our format will be for me to walk you through the poll results, and then I'll moderate the panel discussion. Before we get into the meat of the agenda, I'd like to thank and introduce Stearns Financial Group for sponsoring this initiative. Dennis Stearns is the firm's founder, and he also serves on our board of advisors. He stepped up quickly last year to sponsor that 3-month series of polls that I mentioned. And when we crafted this 3-part series of activities on the future of work, Dennis signed on again to support our efforts. So Dennis, thank you for helping make all of this possible, and welcome you to share some words of greeting for our audience.
Yeah, thank you, Brooks. We're very happy to sponsor these issues, which are extraordinarily important. And so in addition to being a multi-billion-dollar financial planning and investment management firm, we have a very robust business leader practice unit. And in our meetings with business leaders and business owners in the last month, about 80% have on their top 3 agenda lists some of the things we're going to be talking about today. So this is extraordinarily timely. There are some other issues, obviously, that businesses are grappling with, but how their workers engage going forward. And I love that work forward concept is top of mind for almost everybody.
Great. Well, it certainly is. And thank you again very much for supporting our efforts on this. A few logistics before we get started. First, we are recording today's session, and a link to the video and to the poll results will go out to all registrants once we've concluded sometime later today. We also have members of the media as guests today, so there will likely be coverage of our session and of the poll. Second, we hope to weave in questions from our audience. We had over 130 register for today, so we have a pretty good sized group. There are two options for submitting comments on this platform. One is the chat function, which we encourage you to use if you just want to introduce yourself to fellow attendees or to alert our team to any technical issues that you might be having. The other option is a Q&A function, and that's the only place I'll be looking for questions. So please use that to submit any questions that you would like for me to pose to our panel. I'd like to ask that the questions be brief and clear so I can easily relay them. And if you want me to identify you when asking the question, be sure to add into the Q&A your name and affiliation. Otherwise, I'll just pose questions directly without attribution. All right, so let's debrief on the poll. I'm going to call up the slide deck, so I'm going to share screen. Bear with me a moment. Hopefully you can see that. That will make it full. There we go. So we asked about a dozen or so questions, most of them along the lines of what I've already described. There's one extra question, which when I get to it, I'll tell you why we included it in our poll, because it relates to something that we're hosting tomorrow. So heads up on that. First couple of questions are basically how are things going compared to a year ago. So we were asking these questions a year ago. All of us were very impacted in the immediate aftermath of COVID's rampage. And so here we are a little more than a year later. So how's your business doing? And you'll see here that nearly 3/4 say that their business is improved over where it was in March of last year. Almost all the rest said about the same. As you think about your prospects, or as you think about your business prospects for the coming year, we gave the options of optimistic, pessimistic, and unsure. No one said pessimistic, so that's encouraging. Looking ahead, do you anticipate your office space will shrink or increase or stay stable? And you see here that nearly 60% anticipated keeping their office space as is. Another 14% or so said increase. So I think one of the things that surprised me was the question is posed often, gosh, are you going to need as much office space? How will it look, et cetera, with the assumption being maybe you don't need as much office space. And here you see that 70% expect to keep or increase their office space. So we'll circle back on that one. This is sort of the outlier question. You may have seen that Governor Cooper has proposed how he would allocate the nearly $6 billion in COVID federal relief that's coming to North Carolina. So I think it's $5.7 billion altogether. And he's outlined how he would like to allocate that. As part of that, $1.2 billion would be used for the expansion of broadband to areas of the state where it's not available or not as available. Also to address the affordability or the adoption of broadband. A big barrier, particularly in rural areas, is not just the availability, but also the cost. And the third area in that bucket is digital literacy, so that people can make best use of the technology. So we asked the question, is spending public funds to invest in broadband in this way a good idea, a bad idea, or not sure? And obviously, I guess it's no big surprise that the tech sector leadership felt overwhelmingly that's a pretty good idea. I mentioned this because tomorrow I'm hosting the governor's administrative leaders who will brief our members on the proposal overall, and they'll zero in on this broadband proposal and what that looks like, what it means, and how that might be structured. So if you haven't registered for that, that's open to members only, although free, and it is on our events calendar. So if you'll go to nctech.org/events, then you'd be able to register for that if you have not. It'll be tomorrow early, 8 to 9 a.m. live. All right. We asked what percentage of your workforce will have the opportunity to work remote permanently. And there's quite a split here. A lot are unsure. You've got over 25% that have not determined that yet. I think we're early in a lot of that consideration. A lot of leaders are trying to figure out exactly how they will determine who can work remote all the time, who should and who should not. But we gave sort of quartiles here. So up to a quarter will have this opportunity, a quarter to 50%, and so on. You can see the distribution, and it's fairly evenly divided. Then we asked what percentage of your workforce will have the opportunity to work remotely some of the time. And overwhelmingly, that seems to be something that our respondents anticipate offering, because even the 75% to 100% range is showing up with a majority. And then you add in some of the others, it's clearly an overwhelming majority. Are you considering a flex or hybrid work strategy? So the notion of having sort of some days on, some days off, teams in, teams out, what sort of strategies are involved in all of that? And are you working through those? And clearly a strong majority are doing that. We thought this was interesting. Do you anticipate increased hiring competition or attrition due to competitors' work from home policies? And almost two-thirds, say yes. Another chunk unsure. And so this is all about, as you're recruiting new candidates, does your approach to workplace, workflow, hybrid, whatever, is that going to be a factor, a more prominent factor than perhaps it was pre-COVID in attracting candidates? And might it even impact your existing employees and their decisions on whether to remain an employee or leave? And you can see our sector clearly has some concerns about that, or they at least anticipate that'll be a prominent factor. We began asking about some workplace requirements. So what policy, if any, regarding returning workers and vaccinations and masks are you pursuing? A pretty healthy plurality say no mandates and no incentives, just leaving it open. And we also had a few that are mandating only the vaccine, and some that are mandating only a mask, and some that are mandating both. And if you add those up, that gets you to close to 30% that are mandating one or both of those. There was this poll went out around the time that the North Carolina requirements or restrictions were eased. And so these answers didn't necessarily match exactly what every company is doing or what they're taking into consideration, but this gives you a flavor of the degree to which companies might be requiring some degree of accommodation on the part of their employees if they're going to be on site. We also asked, we were very interested in this as an association that gathers people, when will your organization permit employees to attend external events or meetings? I was surprised that so large a percentage said they are already, that they're not restricting that. You'll see that a decent chunk are going to go that way sometime this summer, another decent chunk by the fall, but still a healthy majority are open now to employees attending meetings, conferences, and so forth, as long as whatever the local requirements are being followed. These are the last two. We asked, has your organization invested in tools or programs that promote online collaboration during work from home? Overwhelmingly, not surprised that the tech sector had a strong yes on that. And we asked those who said yes, this final question, which is what's been successful? And you'll see some highlights of trend terms and answers. Some of these are specific to a technology or brand. Others are just practices. So you can sort of take a look there at those results. Again, if you want to have access to this full deck, you can go to nctech.org/pulse. So I'm now going to stop share and get back to our regular format here. All right. So now we'll move into our panel discussion. Again, a reminder that we are recording, and to submit questions, we ask that you use the Q&A function and identify yourself by name and affiliation if you want me to share that as I read the question. Let's kick off by doing a quick round of intros of our 5 panelists. We have 3 tech leaders, we have an employment attorney, and we have a commercial real estate professional. So we're covering a lot of bases today. We actually had a session earlier this spring featuring our attorney panelist on the ins and outs of what employees and employers needed to know regarding workplace policies with respect to vaccines, masks, and so forth. So some of you may have joined us for that when Natalie Sanders was with us as our featured guest. But for today, Joyce, why don't you start off our round of intros?
Good morning. Thanks, Brooks. So my name is Joyce Wieland. I'm president of a local software company here in Raleigh. We have close to 400 employees nationwide, and about 200 of them here in Raleigh. So just for context, as we answer questions, that's our footprint, and we've been here about 35 years. So thanks for having us.
Thank you. All right, Greg, how about you?
Hey, Greg Boon, co-CEO of Blue Acorn ICI. We're an e-commerce and digital experience consultancy, about 400 folks. Similar to Joyce, we probably have about 200 folks here in the Raleigh area. We were recently acquired by Infosys, which has a much larger footprint both in the Raleigh area as well as globally. So happy to be here.
Thank you. Andy.
Yeah, thanks, Brooks. My name is Andy Jenkins. I'm VP of Engineering for Credit Karma with a focus on our Credit Karma Money product, which we recently announced. In 2016, I helped start the office here in Charlotte. We're about 200 employees. Credit Karma is about 1,500 overall. Recently, we announced that Charlotte is now going to become our official East Coast headquarters, and we're planning on hiring about 600 employees over the next couple of years. So a really timely conversation. Very happy to be here. Thanks.
Thank you. Natalie.
Thanks, Brooks. I'm Natalie Sanders. I'm an attorney with Brooks Pierce. Brooks Pierce is a full-service law firm. We have multiple offices in North Carolina. I practice in the labor and employment area and have had the pleasure of coordinating our labor and employment attorneys through the entire COVID crisis to make sure we've been providing good, consistent, thorough advice and consulting to help employers through this difficult time.
Thank you. And Matthew.
Yeah, thank you, Brooks, and good morning, everyone. I'm Matthew Cook. I'm a partner at Davis Moore. We are a boutique commercial real estate advisory firm working exclusively on behalf of the corporate occupiers. We have a 15-person office in Charlotte, in Raleigh, which is our headquarters, and then a growing Charlotte office with about 5 people. I lead our technology practice group, and our experience ranges from publicly traded companies headquartered here in the Triangle with global footprints to venture-backed startups.
Great. Well, thank you all, and thank you especially for making time for this. So what I'll essentially do is use the poll questions as a baseline for getting your feedback and insights. We'll weave in some other topics as well, I'm sure. First, there were a couple of poll results that surprised me. I mentioned some of those as I went through them. I wonder if any of you were surprised by any of the results, either stronger optimism or a surprise on attitudes toward workspace, et cetera. Any of you want to chime in on that? Or was it pretty consistent with what you expected?
I'll go ahead and jump in. One thing that surprised me as an employment attorney, and particularly looking at this industry, was the number of employers who were actually mandating the vaccine. Most of the employers I've been consulting with have been a little reluctant to do that unless it's been a very particular type of setting. And when I think of tech, I think a lot more office setting, not as much direct interaction with the potential virus. And so I was a little bit surprised. Even though it's a low number, it's higher than what I would have expected.
Okay. Any others?
A thing that stood out for me, Brooks, is there was like optimism and growth on the workforce side. 50% of companies about expecting to grow the workforce. But at the same time, only about 15% expecting to increase their office space. So to me, it was this sort of idea that folks are growing, their company, but not necessarily growing their office space. Although, as you pointed out, a lot of companies indicated staying stable as well.
Mm-hmm. Greg?
Yeah, I was, when you were going through the slides earlier, Brooks, the one that kind of caught my eye was the external meetings, the 57% already. I was pretty surprised by that. So I'd like to dig in a little bit more at some point, but we're a little bit more behind the curve, I would say, from that perspective. But that was interesting for me to see. also it was very optimistic to see that.
Mhm. Any others? Well, Andy, I'm going to come back to you then. One of the poll questions was about hiring expectations. We touched on that result already a time or two. Over 80% saying they anticipated growing their headcount. You noted that Credit Karma, although being California-based, has established this hub in Charlotte and just announced 600 new jobs. So what drives your optimism or Credit Karma's optimism, and what drove Credit Karma to focus this growth in North Carolina?
Yeah, I think, I mean, we've just sort of seen, the economy really coming back, the credit markets coming back. And so, business has been good for us. We just found, I think Charlotte has been just a success story of kind of planting a flag here and starting to grow and finding the talent that we needed. And so continuing to build on that. And by, creating a hub or a headquarters on the East Coast in North Carolina, just gives us access to, a whole kind of different, talent-based set of universities, and being in the fintech space, obviously being located to a lot of the financial companies in Charlotte helps us, build up subject matter expertise in the company. I think what I'm really interested in seeing play out is, we take a lot of pride in creating like really nice, Silicon Valley type office experiences for our employees, but it's pretty clear that employees are well adjusted at this point to work from home, and I think folks are kind of looking for an employer situation that will work for them. So some people are very eager to get back to the office, very eager to socialize face to face, but I think others have just really enjoyed the flexibility afforded by work from home. So I think kind of hybrid is just going to be the way forward.
Yeah, there's been a lot written about this topic, and what might be the incentive for employees to want to come back to the office. Some just have a natural interest in doing that, but others, there's this FOMO phenomenon, fear of missing out. That if you're not in the office, that you might miss on developing key relationships or even promotion opportunities, not in a formal way, it just maybe a function of not being there and engaged. There's culture issues there, office culture that come up. So we'll get into some of those, I'm sure, as we move along. I do want to move on to a different poll question then, because you talked about office space. I think one of you mentioned surprise that a large chunk indicated keeping their existing office space, but also a large chunk saying they're growing. How does that square? So obviously that raises the question of companies going to a hybrid approach where they may need the same amount of space they now have, if not more, but maybe not have as many people in that space to provide for spacing among employees, having teams coming and going, or a target percentage of their of their locally based employees in office at a given time on a given day. So Matthew, I'm going to come to you. About 70% to combine say keep or grow. This is your industry, so you must have a pretty good sense of trends here. Did this result surprise you?
It really didn't, Brooks. And I'd love to know what those statistics were 12 months ago as well, as we've continued to go through this, because in the early on in the pandemic, the general theme that we heard a lot of was from our clients was, we may be able to make this work. But as time has gone on, and for a lot of the reasons that you mentioned, culture, recruitment, retention, we've heard some of our clients mention that they've lost the power of osmosis on the training floor and on the sales floor by not having people together. And so we've got one of our clients, Bandwidth, they brought everybody back June 1st, and they said that you could feel the excitement and the energy. And they've done it very successfully, and they're firm believers in that. And they feel like they've been very successful in that and leaders in that approach. The article that came out last week, where Tim Cook's email to the Apple employees, it looks like they're going to have everybody in Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday, which, although there's that hybrid option, they need people together on the same days. And so you're going to need those desks. And so I'm interested, I'd love to know what those responses were 12 months ago. And I'm very curious what it'll be 12 months from now for a lot of those other things that you brought up, the FOMO aspect of it, culture, recruitment, retention. And so that seems to be the general trend, and we're kind of heading back in that place.
Well, there have been a couple of questions posed in the Q&A that kind of relate to this. So I'm going to wrap them together as a follow-up and get other people's comments here. And this has to do with the notion of a hybrid approach, which I think is probably the most common that people are looking at. Very few are going one extreme or the other, where everyone has to come back or nobody comes back. We did ask some questions about working from away or working from home. And I guess it's no surprise that in the tech sector in particular, there's a strong inclination to offer something in the range of either fully remote or a hybrid approach. So for our 3 tech leaders in particular, tell us what your companies are doing or what you're looking at, or where are you in that decision-making process, and what you're still trying to figure out. How do you manage in a hybrid environment? Anybody can kick off.
I'll tell you what we're doing at Softpro. So we opened our offices this week to, allow people to come into the office. We had signups that people knew which team players were coming in from their specific teams, because I think, to Matthew's point of we want that collaboration of, specific teams being together. So we wanted to bring visibility for all employees to know your team members are coming in, these days. And, right now we're giving people the flexibility to come in. We haven't set a certain number of days. It's just the office is open. Your team members, may or may not be here on certain days. Why don't you come in and start to collaborate? And we feel, our thought is over time, people are going to, there is that fear of missing out aspect. And, I think over the last year and a half, people have missed collaborating with their coworkers and talking to them, and the water cooler talk, and, the kitchen, et cetera. So, it's over the next couple of months, I think will be very telling, especially once we get through the summer and then, kids are back in school, and, the fall, I think we'll see more and more people come into the office just because people like to be here, and it may clearly not be 5 days a week. And we're not pushing that at this point. Or requiring that.
Yeah, this, it's been a bit of a challenge, for us. I have the fortunate timing of we renovated our offices and opened a brand new office expansion April 1st, 2020. So no one's actually ever seen the office and the new footprint that we have and all of this. We doubled the size and all these great things. But what we're working through right now is, we're not fully open yet. We're having a lot of the conversations through the summer. We're going to be surveying the employees. We want to do what's right, not just from a sense of how safe people feel coming into the office or how it's configured, but also what does childcare look like? What are some of the other things that kind of pull on that decision? So we are very much looking at a hybrid model, but we're going to be informed by the data, not just from the CDC, but from what our employees say and others. And I think that, fall is probably the time where we'll start to make more of those decisions as we kind of, as schools open back up, daycares and other things that will allow for more folks to be in these collaborative spaces. The other challenge I would say is during this pandemic time, we've actually hired a lot more people that aren't based in Raleigh or aren't based in any of our corporate locations, right? So now what do you do now where we've grown as an organization? Our business has actually done very well because we're in this e-commerce for Fortune 500 and, large enterprise clients, right? But we have people all over the world now that are part of our team. So what does that mean? Are we going to be flying them in? Are we going to be doing things other places? So we're trying to think it through, but yeah, at some point we need to figure out what does that mean. I would say the other comment I was going to make is to kind of Matthew's comments. Part of the reason why we're keeping the footprint and could potentially grow the footprint is not necessarily just for all of our employees, but it's also for some of our clients and to create more collaborative spaces as well. So we're looking at how do we repurpose the office so that it's not the exact same use, if you will, as before.
How about you, Andy?
Yeah, I think it's funny what Greg said about, creating this office space that no one is able to see. We had an experience of, recruiting a bunch of new grads from NC State and Georgia Tech and kind of touting the office space. And then by the time they actually joined us, we were shut down. So, we have, 200 employees in Charlotte, but half of them have never been to the physical office. So I think a lot of people are eager to get back to that. But I kind of echo Joyce in that I think we're just kind of testing the waters right now. I think they're ahead, at Softpro where we're at. But I think summer is going to be a time of starting to get people back into the office, starting to experience like this, hybrid, workspace. I think, pointing out, school schedules and summer is always like camps and, shuttling here and there, right? So, and vacations as well. So I don't think that there's a lot of, pressure or rush to get back into the office. And then I think, we'll see where we are with, the COVID numbers. We're watching closely. I think everybody is, to make sure, because safety is the priority, right? So I think as we get closer, we'll kind of see how the summer is going with these kind of voluntary and slow paced kind of back to work, and then kind of see where we are in the fall.
Well, Andy, let me ask you a follow-up to that, and then I'm going to come to you, Matthew, because my next question happens to be one about what are tenants asking of their landlords or tenant reps in terms of office reconfiguration and so forth. Andy, you're here as a representative of a company that's not headquartered here. Greg, you now have a parent company that certainly is not headquartered here and has lots of sites around the world. I'm curious what degree of flexibility and autonomy you have at the local level, which is not where the headquarters is, to make decisions on some of these topics we've been discussing about mandating who comes to work and who doesn't, policies around masks and that sort of thing. What's the degree of mothership versus local site autonomy? Start with you, Andy.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would say is we're kind of consistent across sites, but it's following a lot of like the local guidance. So for example, the COVID numbers are actually low enough in Oakland now that they returned to work ahead of Charlotte. We had, a little bit of, I guess we were just kind of slower to draw down the numbers in May. So we're now looking at starting to get folks back in a week or two. So it's sort of like looking at the local situation on the ground. Our workplace services certainly surveyed folks in different, sites to kind of understand their eagerness and preference to get back to work. One thing that we have done that has been great is autonomy around, I would say, sort of like local events and gatherings and get-togethers, right? So we've just kind of had employees sort of spontaneously gathering and getting together in South End or wherever it happens to be. So that's more how we've handled it, and then just kind of followed the corporate guidance in terms of the actual return to work.
Right.
And I'm sorry, Greg, you say something? Go ahead.
No, yeah, I was just going to say, being a part of Emphasis, right? It's we have a lot of autonomy as it relates to how we make decisions for our people and for our office location. And one of the things that we also have to think through is half of my board and the largest majority of the Emphasis company sits in India, and it's a very different situation going on in India. So part of what I have to tell my leadership team is, even because things are great or much better here, relatively speaking, right, we also have to be cognizant of the fact that what message does it send if we're just all going back into the office right now when I have folks that are completely locked down that we're working with on a day-to-day basis. So there are other things that we have to consider and think through, in the best interest of our people and our parent company.
Matthew, what are you hearing from tenants in terms of how they want assistance or guidance from you and peers of yours in the buildings and logistics side of things?
Absolutely. Well, I think that Andy touched on it in his comment about these impromptu get-togethers, and that culture and collaboration and relationships are very critical and important right now to all the business leaders that we're talking to. And so for a group that's looking at relocating and moving across town into a new space, there's a huge emphasis on what amenities are close by. Because if we are going to go to that hybrid model where people are only going to have to come in 3-4 days a week, then what the clients want is a place where their people can go get coffee together, lunch together, get drinks after work, that sort of thing. And then in a market like Raleigh and then parts of Charlotte as well, and across the state, we've a very suburban inventory, in suburban rich inventory. So it's how do we build those spaces within the space if we don't have like, something downtown Raleigh, downtown Charlotte is easy access. So how do we build those areas into the space? Those are the big things. And then everybody always wants more conference rooms, right? So that's a big thing too.
Well, that is true. And before I have a question I want to move to, but I think Dennis may have a thought or a question on this topic before I switch. Dennis, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I did. So in a recent conversation with a business leader in Raleigh, I was asking him about things that were top of mind. Now, this was a tech-enabled company, not a direct tech company. And he said, well, number one is my supply chain continues to be this flowing amorphous thing because of things they get out of countries overseas and states in the United States that have different issues around COVID. And so that's a major headache. But then he said something really interesting. He said, and kids, pandemic dogs, and traffic are really a headache for me. And I said, well, what are you talking about? And he said, well, first of all, it's already been mentioned on this that some of our folks who want to work from home, they're trying to do kid duty, and now they have to figure out childcare. I mean, that is just a huge topic. And in one of our previous roundtables with a number of CEOs, we heard that mentioned. And then balancing that off with the culture issue that Matthew has mentioned a couple of times. The pandemic dog issue was a sort of an interesting one because we hear this coming up more and more. Oh, I got a dog during the pandemic. Now I don't know what to do with them because, I'm going to be coming into work and who's going to take the dog out? And then the traffic issue, we have clients in Austin and a variety of other places and Silicon Valley where traffic can get daunting at times. And we don't have good trends in that area in the Triangle. So our own firm, our Triangle operations have a little different planning around hybrid than our Greensboro Triad operations do.
Interesting. Yeah, that's true. Site to site can very much be different.
I do just want to add one thing, if I could, that, we've talked a lot about, the collaboration of having employees come back into the office. I think our largest and the biggest challenge is going to be the remote employees or the people that want to stay at home, how to make sure that we can involve them in the collaboration and make sure that, if they don't feel comfortable coming back into the office, we need to make sure that they still feel part of the company and the culture and they're able to collaborate. And I think that's going to be the biggest challenge, is making sure that everybody feels included and engaged. We've used Microsoft Teams, throughout this whole pandemic. We were able to launch it a year prior, and it's been a saving grace for us because it's really been able to foster and that collaboration that we need throughout the organization. So.
And that gets to one of the poll questions. I think the last one was, have you deployed tools in various ways to foster the remote or hybrid approach, and what are they? And we had a lot of examples offered there that related not just to technologies, but also to approaches to keeping people somehow connected, not technically connected, but connected to each other. And so that'll continue to be something I'm sure that folks work to figure out. Natalie, I want to come back to you now. One of the big and tricky subjects, you touched on it briefly already, is the issue of how and whether to mandate things, vaccines, masks, or other measures for on-site employees or visitors, et cetera. The public mandates have continued to ease, essentially now having been lifted in North Carolina. What are some of the considerations employers are still grappling with?
Yeah, fortunately, we've gotten a little bit of guidance from the EEOC about incentivizing and mandating vaccines. And so there are ways to do it that aren't going to violate the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is the main law applicable. What we're really waiting on is some sort of good guidance from OSHA, because of course, OSHA is the entity that has the authority to address workplace safety and health issues. And they've been pretty silent through the whole thing. And we thought we were going to get some emergency standards from them, but they didn't act very quickly. And now we're at the stage where they would have a tough time justifying it as an emergency standard. But the Biden administration seems committed to working out some sort of infectious disease standard for workplaces. So I think we'll end up with some sort of guidance. Whether or not that will give us what we need to make more companies comfortable mandating vaccines, I don't know. I think there's a reluctance in the Biden administration to be seen as mandating that because, of course, they're very employer rights friendly. And there are a lot of employees that don't want to do that. So I think we're seeing employers just doing their best. And some are saying, whatever the risks may be, we think as a public policy, people need to get vaccinated, and they're working through that. Other employers are saying, hey, I can mandate vaccines for everyone coming into my office because, and this may be why we saw higher numbers in the tech area than I would have expected, working from home is working. And so if they don't get vaccinated, I can accommodate anyone, whether it's a health reason or not, by just saying you can work from home. And so they're saying, if you're going to come in the office, be vaccinated. So I think everyone's kind of doing their best at this point without good, clear legal guidance.
Well, that's what we have you for.
Yeah. And that's what we're doing right now is we're a little bit making it up.
Yeah.
Brooks, if you don't mind, I want to comment on something that Greg mentioned, because I think this is going to be one of the big issues for employers, and I think especially tech employers as we progress and see these hybrids. And he mentioned how we're hiring people and they're not all here where our headquarters or our office is located, they're all over. And when those start crossing state lines, we get a whole lot of legal issues because typically the law that applies to your employees is the law where they're working. And so I've seen clients who've had employees move out of state, and now all of a sudden that employer is going, well, now do I have to be licensed to do business in this other state because I now have employees there? Now, am I subject to all of the benefits laws in this other state? And especially outside of North Carolina. North Carolina is a very employer-friendly state. And other states will have things like mandatory paid leave benefits. They'll have very different standards. And now suddenly companies that have never had to deal with those types of laws are going to be dealing with them, and maybe with just a very few number of employees. And that's going to be, I think, a trend where as we do these hybrids and people want to live anywhere and work from there, employers are going to suddenly be doing business in other states and have to deal with all of this.
Good points. Absolutely. It gets complicated. We've got a few questions being posed from our audience. So I want to go through those and maybe move through them fairly quickly. So we might not take 5 or 6 comments on each one, but I am going to probably direct them, at least if they're obviously relevant to one or more of you. So I think for the 3 of you who are tech leaders, someone poses, there are a lot of professional society meetings and meetup groups, et cetera, in the major metros like the Triangle and Charlotte and so forth. And this person says they'd be interested in hearing when the employers on this panel might feel comfortable in hosting these professional meetings at your offices again. So there are groups that tend to meet, on site, somebody hosted in their space. Are you all doing that already? Would you consider doing it? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we're not actually doing that right now. I think my overall opinion of that is, again, it's all comes down to safety. I think if it's controllable, I don't know about 60. I saw the question. I don't know about 60 folks, right? But if it's a manageable number, and I think the thing that makes that a little bit more promising than necessarily having all of my employee base, back in the office is you can control the timing of that, right? It's one thing to have a 30-person event for an hour or 2 hours, and then, okay, everybody's got to go home and get out. It's another thing to just have free flowing everywhere and not being able to kind of control the situation. So I'd say I'm more, I actually recently had my first client back in the office in 18 months last week. And I actually offered up our office space to do some of their strategic planning in August, because I was a little bit more comfortable with that than just making a decision on all employees coming all the time or not. So I would say that I'm more open to that idea because it's more, assuming it's more limited.
Joyce?
Yeah, I would agree with Greg. I mean, right now we're focused on the employees and getting them back into the office, and I'm not sure that we've even ventured down the thought of, hosting something in our office at this point. If it was a beautiful day outside, maybe we might do something for a limited amount of time, but I don't think at this point, it would probably have to be a couple more months before we entertain that, just to see how things play out with the vaccine and the cases.
And
Yeah, I think similar as well. We have hosted meetups at our office. It's a great way to kind of show off the space and recruit some talent, right? But yeah, there's got to be a progression there. I think we're worried, first and foremost about employees. I think then we'll be starting to look at customers and partners, right? You sort of have to align on your protocols and level of safety there. And I think these sort of voluntary meetings where it could be just kind of anyone from the community coming in. I think that'll be further along in the progression.
Great. Same three. I'll ask the next question of, we touched on this a little bit, but this gives a bit of a different angle to it. For the tech leaders, do you have any concerns with the lack of consistency that the hybrid model might create? Do you think the flexible approach might lead to productivity and collaboration issues? I think, Joyce, you talked about this a little bit, where you're not necessarily at this point doing a lot of structure around who has to be in the office when, but you also recognize there might be a feeling of missing out if people don't come, and that might generate a desire to be there. Maybe you could kick off the answer to that one. Any concerns about how the hybrid model might challenge productivity and collaboration?
Yeah, I mean, I equate it to not only the hybrid model, but like I mentioned earlier, just remote employees that are, full-time remote, right? I mean, there's nothing like being in a conference room with somebody and drawing things out on a whiteboard and making strategic plans that way. And so it's just, we're going to continue to try different avenues on how to best collaborate. But sure, I mean, obviously, the answer is we'd love to have everybody together, but that's not where we are, and that's not where we're going to be. And we're going to try to figure out the best way to make this work in the most collaborative way possible. And you really use our employees as the barometer of what's working for them. What do we need to tweak? They're the ones, doing this every day, and we need their feedback. It's not really for us to just dictate what we think is going to work, right? It's going to be a collaborative effort, and each team is different, at least for Softpro, and so we're just going to navigate over the next couple months and years until we figure this out and we come up with the best possible solution.
Yeah, I would second that. Right? I'm pretty concerned about it. Right? I think that one of the things that I used to tell our team in the early days of the pandemic was the great equalizer of everyone working from home. Right? There's no more judging. At the beginning of this conversation, I had to turn off my video because I had to run out and ask my wife to grab the 4-year-old and 2-year-old because they were fighting, and it was about to get very loud. Right? But if everyone is going through that, it made it, it was this normalization factor, right? But what I've seen that's kind of to answer the question directly, but also to talk about some things indirectly, I've gotten a lot of pressure from clients that have all over the world who've changed their policies. And then they're asking, hey, when are you guys going back in the office? Or when can you come here? Right? Or when can you do this? And, so we're trying to set a precedent with our own employees, and then that's dictating it. And then I've been in situations where, I could sense how others are going to feel, where I'm remote and I have 15 people in a room on a client site that are all collaborating. And then I'm like, what was that? I couldn't hear that. What are you drawing on the board? Right. So I think as organizations, and I guess overall as a tech community, we're going to have to figure out how to innovate to enforce greater collaboration. There's going to be some change management necessary. There's going to have to be different behaviors, right, as our leaders, to make sure that folks are being included in the conversation, right? And we're pulling those people that are going to be remote. Because like I said, it's not going to change for us. We're going to continue to hire all over the world now. Like it's, the floodgates are open. I'm in a scenario where there is way more demand, which I think we could see based on the poll results that you showed. But that didn't change the supply overnight of actual people in this space. Great for tech community, right? But it's, one of the other questions is going to be around talent. That's going to be a drain.
Well, I want to pick up on that briefly before I move to you, Andy, if you have something to add as well. But some years ago, we were able to line up the then CEO of Microsoft, Steve Ballmer, to come headline a conference that we were hosting. And so, as you can imagine, when you get someone like that to travel and speak at your event, there's a lot that goes into the planning of that. So we had lots of calls and planning sessions with the array of team members on the Microsoft side that were involved in all of that. And so when the conference arrived, it was in Charlotte. And so we had a hotel base where we were going to be. The Microsoft key team said, why don't we all meet for dinner in the hotel restaurant? It'd be nice to do that the night before the event. So we all gathered there, and it surprised me because it was before this whole COVID thing where everybody's doing video. It surprised me that all these Microsoft people were hugging and greeting each other, saying, it's nice to finally meet you. And they had worked together in many cases for years and had been in different cities and had never met. I think Steve Ballmer's executive assistant worked in a different state. And so that was their normal. And for them, they had never had occasion to be physically together. My point in telling that story is remote working clearly is not new. It's just new on the scale. And the notion that every organization has to figure out how to incorporate it, that's new. And so it certainly is a different ballgame now. But there are some lessons learned from the past state of things that I think we can draw from. Andy, did you want to add into that or to move on?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that you say that. So I joined Credit Karma in 2014 as a individual, software developer, remote. I was one of like the only remote employees at Credit Karma. And, I really liked that form of work, but I was just kind of known as this giant head on the TV screen. And so when I actually went to San Francisco and walked down the halls, people would be doing a double take to actually see me, in person. But, I loved it then. I thought I would be okay with COVID, but now that I'm a manager, I really miss like the daily micro interactions that you get. And so I think ultimately we're going to end up, balancing the sort of what does the business need and what do the employees want, right? And like when it comes to talent, Greg mentioned talent, like applicants didn't really used to ask with high frequency what the work from home situation is going to be like. Can you imagine not asking that if you talk to a prospective employer today? So, and I think it depends on the business. Greg's in a very client-facing business. We're in ours where we're doing mostly product development. We don't have a need to sort of align with customers a lot on timing and protocols and things like that. So I think we're in a little more space of flexibility, I would say. But I think everybody's going to have to sort of sort out what's best for their company and employees.
Well, I'm going to combine two questions then because the talent topic has arisen several times here. So I'll read them both, but they're related. The war for talent is real. How are you all doing with finding talent with a seemingly large number of employees opting to look for companies that offer fully remote work? And then a related question, considering the number of announcements lately from large tech companies like Apple creating a presence in the state and the increased demand of employees and candidates to work more flexibly, are there concerns about the demand for tech talent in the short to mid-term to fill open positions? What are you doing to prevent possible attrition? So who wants to tackle those topics?
I don't think you can prevent attrition. You can certainly try your best to mitigate it through culture and other things. For me, 10 years ago when we started our practice, we were in a similar state just because of the niche of the field that we were in, and what we recognized is that lack of supply created the perfect opportunity for us to manufacture talent and create a new business model, and for us to grow into where we are as Blue Acorn ICI. I tell my leadership team right now we're in a similar situation for different dynamics, right? That supply, that lack of supply is real. That, war for talent is very real, but we can't just simply try to battle that war in the same way that we've done historically, right? Use some of the tools, use some of the expertise, some of the things that you've, perfected over the years to actually figure out how you can manufacture talent, as well as you got to think differently and open up your mind to that point. You're in a digital first world in many instances for a lot of these folks, and remote is what folks are going to be looking for in many parts. So if you're going to pigeonhole yourself to only looking at folks who will only work in your office location, good luck.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, obviously, like the sort of genie is out of the bottle for homework, and like we've always had, flexibility for work from home. You have the cable person coming over, et cetera. So there's been that flexibility there, but I think companies are ultimately going to sort out like what's right for their culture in terms of the presence that they want in the office, and employees are going to select based on that, right? So I think that there could be a shifting. But, just like there is today, like if you're a software engineer and you want to travel and you want to be face-to-face, well, you're going to look for that type of company that offers travel and face-to-face engagement with customers. If you want to be a heads down software engineer, you're going to look for a company that provides that opportunity. And, those jobs might be a lot more amenable to remote work. So I definitely think there'll be a sort of shuffling and maybe realignment. But companies are ultimately going to have to just sort of align, their policy to the type of talent they're going to want to recruit and retain.
Well, I have a technology question that actually applies both to Matthew's world and to those of you who are leading tech companies. One of the questions posed is, what are some of the technologies that might be newer to most of us that you are looking at or have deployed to facilitate this hybrid approach or the remote worker? But a related question for you, Matthew, would be what kinds of technologies are you seeing or are you aware of that are out there about the physical workspace? Maybe it's in general, we're all healthier if we're not touching a lot of stuff. The flu is spread that way, and colds and so on. So is it using badges to open doors instead of your hands? I mean, what kind of configuration issues are there that can address that? So maybe we'll start with you, Matthew, since you haven't spoken in a while on that question, then I'll broaden it to tools that are workflow oriented.
So during the pandemic, when the kind of peak time last spring, when everybody was at home, there were a number of property owners in our market that took that as a time to go ahead and upgrade a lot of their building systems because nobody was in the building and it wouldn't be much of a nuisance. So HIPAA air filtration systems in the air conditioning was a big thing, like kind of the same systems that the airplanes had all put in to have better air cleaning capabilities. Handless touch entry on a number of areas like doors, hand sanitizer everywhere, which is an easy one. So that sort of thing certainly happened in terms of technology upgrades with elevators and doors and just air handlers and that sort of thing. Another big technology thing that has started to take place and a lot of tenants have been asking about in the urban settings is parking. If we're only going to have people coming in shifts and I've got to buy a parking space for each employee, how can we have a pass shared amongst employees to cut down on the parking cost? So that's a big one that's coming up that will be solved. There are solutions out there and it's an easy one to solve, but that's coming up a lot as well.
Hadn't thought about the parking question. That's really interesting. You're right. How about from the tech leaders? Are there tools other than the obvious ones? Someone mentioned, I think, Joyce, that you had already adopted Teams, and now that's sort of prevalent throughout your organization. But what kinds of tools might you be looking at, or have you implemented?
So I wouldn't say that we implemented a lot of new tools, right? We use a lot of collaboration tools before, because again, our clients are everywhere and our people. But where we actually invested, more was actually in our employee experience team members. So we grew our HR group to create more of a VIP kind of white glove for our employee base, to have someone that's more focused on bringing everybody together and ensuring that collaboration and ensuring that there was a more unified experience. So we kind of leaned in a different way. So it wasn't tools as much as we actually invested in people to actually focus on running those type of employee experience programs.
Andy, how about you? Anything new or unusual?
No, I think it's just, using the tools that we had, very, very, very extensively, way more than we had been using them before. And I kind of look at it as more of a, like we kind of had the tools already. It's just broadening the use. And then as we get into this situation where you've got, a couple of people in Oakland, a couple of people in Charlotte, and a couple of people from home, I think we're just going to be developing some new hygiene around how you make sure everyone feels included, how you make sure, everyone, has their voice heard, and you're creating a good culture. I think just like we all adapted to, everybody being faces on the screen in Zoom, I think we're going to have the same kind of thing once we've got this kind of mix of people physically together as well as people remote.
Gotcha. Before I get to the next question, just a quick heads up that one of the reporters who's on our call today, I posted it in the chat if anybody wants to go to chat and see the question there, but it has to do with a story she's working on where she'd be interested in anyone being aware in the RTP area of employers or workspaces that are undergoing renovations due to the pandemic, changing up how they're organized physically, et cetera. So she'd welcome hearing from you. What?
I will be in touch. I'll shoot it.
There you go. You probably have a lot of examples. We have someone who's asked, and we touched on this a little bit, the recruiting of employees. One of you said, can you imagine not asking the question now as a candidate, what's your work from home strategy going forward? Whereas that might have been a rare question a year and a half ago. But the question posed is, how have your HR and marketing strategies evolved in your firm's talent recruitment and retention programs? Does anybody want to expound on that a little bit? I mean, Greg, you mentioned you're hiring all over, and you might not have hired as much all over before. This opens up the possibility to do that. So that might be one strategy shift.
Yeah, I mean, we had to start to really expand and look everywhere. And when I say everywhere, not even just the US, like we have, conversations about, Czech Republic, Mexico, how do we leverage our parent company who has, geography all over the globe, right? Like that's one aspect of it. The other kind of reality that we're facing, a lot of the candidates these days, like the overwhelming majority of the candidates, are coming attached to a recruiter, coming attached with an agent in mind, which has also been a little challenging, right? The whole, just more broadly, just kind of openly speaking, to this group, there used to be a time where when you gave someone an offer letter, there was like a 99% chance that person would say yes. Now it seems like the culture has changed, that's when the negotiations start. And it's not just for the most senior candidate, right? Like the war for talent is starting at a much earlier level. So I keep going back to the manufacturing of talent. We're in a great location. The reason why we have, one of our corporate offices in the Raleigh area is because of all of the university systems, all of the other companies that do similar work, right? So being able to manufacture talent for us, but yeah, opening up our minds and thinking differently to a completely remote world and say, if there's no more walls, if there's no more geography, let's go at it.
Yeah, for Softpro, I would echo, what Greg has said. All positions are now eligible to be remote, where before, there was only certain positions that had that little checkbox, and now it's, if you want to be a developer, you can be a developer in any state. If you want to be QA, it doesn't matter the position. And so it feeds to, now we have a broader field of talent to pull from. And so now we've gotten employees that have joined on board that, may have people in the industry, because we're a real estate software company, right? That now they recommend Softpro, in Montana, where we wouldn't have had an employee there before, right? And so it's been an interesting change in the recruiting process for sure.
Yeah, and it occurs to me, Brooks, that we ought to lean in with our friends at IBM since it's ironic that IBM, right before the pandemic started, was pulling the plug on a lot of their remote work. They were trying to get people back in together. And my understanding is that there's been a continual evolution of thought there. And they've been splashing around in this area for a long, long time.
Andy, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, we have some positions that are remote, but most of our positions are, associated with one of our offices, either Charlotte or Oakland. I think one of the things that's been interesting that, we've seen, and I'm sure others as well, and, Joyce probably being headquartered in North Carolina, the pandemic has caused people to think a lot about work-life balance, quality of life, et cetera. And I think, in that area, North Carolina has just become a lot more attractive, right? Like the, just sort of like the ability to buy a home, the good school systems, the low taxes, the ability to get to the mountains or get to the beach or really choose your living arrangements. And so I feel like even though we, we're going to end up naturally selecting for people that want to come and be in an office environment, but I feel like we're well positioned in North Carolina to be able to do that.
Got you. Well, Natalie, I want to come back to you on something you touched earlier on, some of the legal complexities of, for example, hiring a person remotely who is in a different state than you have operated in, excuse me, before, or an employee who moves to another state to work remotely. What are some of the legal considerations, if any, that play into decisions that employers make on which employees have the option to work remotely and which can be required to work on site? Are there risks there in terms of equity or being fair or consistent in how you apply those decisions?
The biggest issue is going to be reasonable accommodations under the Americans with Disabilities Act for people who have a real need to work remotely, and making sure that those accommodations are being made. So having a hard and fast rule that these positions you must come in and these positions you can work remotely, even for those where you say these are the ones where you have to come in, if there's not a solid business justification for it, an employer will still have to make reasonable accommodations there that may include remote work. So it's not that easy to draw bright lines unless you can really say you can't clean the office remotely, right? It's got to be something that you really have to be there to do. So I think they're going to see those kinds of issues that they have to address. And then again, like I said, figuring out where they're working remotely. I've seen some clients who are saying, look, we're going to tell people you can work remotely, but we're not authorized to do business in these other states. So you have to be in these 1 or 2 states. So someone may have to relocate even if they're not coming to the office because the employer isn't willing. I think the competitive environment, like Greg has been mentioning, employers are just going to have to deal with whatever the state law implications are where the employees and talent are that they find.
Got you. You talked about mobility of employees, and we've all talked about employees can pretty much be anywhere these days. One of the questions posed in the Q&A is, do you think about tapping into the workforce in suburban and underserved communities? For example, if you really can hire from anywhere now, when before that might not have been as much of a focus, does this present an opportunity that can help the economies of individual families and regions in places that may not have been hotbeds for hiring in the past for your organizations?
Yeah, I'm sorry, was that?
No, I'm sorry. I was just going to say that sounds like it goes back to what we were talking about before with Governor Cooper's plan. And is it going to be technologically possible to recruit there and have viable workforces? We need to make sure that happens.
Right.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, a few years back, we were looking at that as a potential for how we grew our actual office footprint, right? Could we find some, more suburban or more rural areas where we could get maybe some cheaper office space that was closer to maybe some smaller universities and things, and could that be an opportunity for us to grow? And obviously, we're not necessarily thinking the same way from a real estate footprint perspective anymore. But I do think that there is a great opportunity, and that's, I try to task our folks to have no blinders. Brooks, you've had me on for unconscious bias panels and other things, right? It's amazing how people think if they see some, city in Alabama or some other place, but if you can abstract out those things, you can find some great talent all over the country, right? So I think that as employers in general, we have to do a better job and make sure that we don't apply any kind of unconscious bias based on where folks are, because the talent is out there, and you're going to have folks. I actually have folks that want to move from Raleigh to other areas also, right? We talk a lot about recruiting. I have folks like, hey, I want to move to the middle of nowhere, or to Montana, is I think Joyce mentioned, right? So then what do you do in those situations? But I do think it's a great opportunity, actually.
I would observe too, I do a lot of work, as you can imagine, with the state and local economic development organizations as companies are being recruited here. Sometimes incentives are offered by the state or localities to get a company to agree to grow by a certain number. I don't know if that was the case with Credit Karma, for example, with the announcement of 600 new jobs. It is very common for that to be the case. And what's interesting is the old model of any company X being able to say, we'd like a grant from the state or some tax abatement from the state in exchange for our pledge to hire X number of more employees in this at this site. Well, the site is no longer a thing. There might be a site, but it's not like 800 people are going to work physically in that building. How do you even determine what the IBM headcount is in North Carolina, or the Cisco headcount is in North Carolina, or the Infosys, which has one of those agreements in place in North Carolina? And how does this new arrangement, this new world order, affect previously agreed to commitments on, we commit to 2,000 people over 5 years or 600 people over 5 years? So I'd be curious, Andy, your thoughts on that, and maybe Greg in particular, since you've got the Infosys connection, if you have any.
Yeah, and speaking of work from home, if you can hear a vacuum cleaner in the background, I could only hold it off for so long here. But yeah, we did get incentives from the state. I think I'm not familiar with the particulars of those, but what I expect it means is that we will employ employees in the state of North Carolina. And that will not necessarily mean that they are all, in the office, 100% of the time. I think that goes back to some of the other conversations that we were talking about. I think, Greg made a good point about, does this, support diversity? And I think, we're progressing, I think, to be able to have a more diverse workforce. One of the things about, recruiting in North Carolina was access to a whole new talent base, access to, companies or for people to work for a Bay Area kind of company in North Carolina. There are challenges with that. We were used to recruiting from name brands like Google and Facebook, and you're not necessarily going to see that from the talent pool here. But I think we're continuing to see a more diverse workforce.
Yeah, I mean, Brooks, as you know, being a part of Infosys, Infosys made a commitment to Raleigh in the state of North Carolina a few years back. I think it was like 1,500 or 2,000 jobs. So I work closely now with our site leader here in Raleigh, Devery Learman, on, how do we collaborate and start to grow that footprint, right? And how do we bring more folks in? But to your point around what does site mean anymore, right? We may have folks that are in Greenville, right, North Carolina. We may have folks that, who knows, but they report in and they will come in for collaboration and certain events at different times. That's another thing that I think we all have to think through, as well as we have more workforces, making sure that we create a budget to actually bring in those remote workers into our office space, whether that's for holidays or company meetings or whatever. Again, giving them an opportunity. It's so great to finally see these folks, that you may have only seen through a screen, for the last 6 months. But I think, diversity matters a lot to me personally. And I think we all have an opportunity to look and think differently in this new world, because there's no more barriers as to where, folks are. So I would implore everyone to, keep an open mind and to think through how you can pull on different talent pools that you may have never thought of.
Good point, and for sure. I touched on this topic earlier in our discussion about employees being able to go to meetings and gatherings without restriction in terms of company mandates. But one of the biggest questions in this discussion around speed of getting back to in-person meetings and events is also travel policy. Some of the larger companies have announced that no non-essential business travel can occur for still some months to come. Although, as I noted, our poll showed that about 60% have no such restrictions. Another chunk expect to eliminate those restrictions sometime this summer. I'm curious for our three tech leaders on the question of travel. If an employee said, I've got a business conference coming up that I'd like to go to, or there's a retreat I'd like to go to, or do you have policies that prevent them from doing so, or allows it, but it's got to be one-day travel and no overnight or no plane? How do you address that?
I wouldn't say that we're actually preventing that right now. It's more of a, you do it on your own your own time, your own dime situation. We're not trying to encourage it at this moment, but at the same time, like we've had some folks that have gotten together across teams that are at different offices. They've gotten together. We have an office in Charleston, South Carolina, for instance. Just last week, we had a group on the same team all kind of get together and collaborate there. Part of it was work. Part of it was just socializing, right? And getting together in a different environment outside. But we're trying to weigh all of those things right now. As I mentioned, I, as the co-CEO, had my very first meeting with the client face-to-face last week, right? So we're trying to lead by example. But once we do, right, we do want to make sure that we give clear guidance on, safety and understanding, depending on what state you're in, where our client is, what they're looking at as well. So we're in a kind of a wait and see mode right now also.
What else?
The last 60 days, we've had a handful of employees start traveling, very limited. I mean, it's, obviously manager approval and the employee signs off that, they're comfortable, and, it's very, there's a very concerted discussion at the moment, before anybody travels. And there's a, what's the return on investment for, whatever conference we're going to. And so we're easing back into it. So I would say travel restrictions have been lifted, if you want the official, policy, but it's still very touch and go, depending on the situation and the employee and if they're comfortable. And if, the customer, for any trainers that go on site, the customer is comfortable, obviously, and there's a lot of sign off and everybody's on board. So it's not being mandated at a company level that you must travel.
Nor being prohibited.
Correct.
Andy, you've got dual coast here.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're in a little bit of the same boat. It's kind of like, if you want to do something for professional development, we provide a budget for that, but it's up to you to figure out, your own kind of travel and level of safety that you're comfortable with. We're starting to try to get kind of like voluntary as we get back to the office. We don't want to be 200 people that never met each other anymore and just have to rely on bumping into each other at the coffee station, right? So we've started to encourage employees that are vaccinated, started to create events to socialize there. Having an Oakland headquarters, we're going to have to get back to travel. I think there's just no substitute for it. Greg knows this very well. It's really so much easier to establish relationships and trust in person. And so I really hope to be getting back to that soon. I think personally, I'm going to be going back to Oakland as soon as there is no mask mandate in the office, I think, and once we get people coming there, so that I can go there and see my coworkers in person. So I think we'll get back to a healthy rate of travel between the offices.
Good to hear. I had my first flight last week in over a year and a half, and it was fairly normal except for the mask. We have a question I'm going to broaden a little bit. It'll be our last question. With work from home being more mainstream, what is the group's thoughts on employees being able to work less than, not more than, the traditional 8 hours a day? And I think what we're getting at here is, for example, I don't commute. anymore. Working remotely, you've got an hour or more back of your life. You tend to not take a full lunch hour, and you may not even work within a standard work day. I've always been the type that works outside of hours anyway, so that's not unusual for me. But how do you approach making sure there's a reasonable balance for your employees when they're working remotely, so that on the one hand, they're available in real time to their colleagues and to your customers, maybe core hours or something, and they also don't feel that they've got to be on all the time just because at any given moment there are people on and engaged within your team? How do you address that?
Now, one of the things that we found, and I bet a lot of other folks found as well, is people are feeling like more productive during the pandemic with work from home because of that, not needing to commute, but also like more stressed out and finding it harder to find that balance. That's at least what we found. I mean, we're not a company where we've ever had people clocking in and clocking out. So I think kind of like hours spent at work has never really been a thing for us. It's more, are you meeting the responsibilities of the job, the expectations of the job? Running services around the clock. We do have, on-call rotations for our software engineers. So there are times where you're expected to be available, but, by separating that out, that means that the rest of the folks that aren't on call, aren't expected to be online all the time.
Yeah, we've tried to more culturally shift to moving from hours to outcomes is kind of the message I try to describe, and make sure that we kind of lead by focusing on that and less on because I try to tell folks, I was like, I don't know if you work 2 hours or you work 10, but I know whether you did this or you didn't do it, right? So it's more about how do we kind of empower our folks, as well as, create the right trust mechanisms that they're actually, producing the outcomes that you would expect versus kind of punching a clock. I am concerned. I felt myself the other day when I met with my client, I was to your point, Brooks, I just wasted an hour driving back and forth, and I had limited ability to work. Yeah, I can make some calls, but I couldn't Slack with anyone. I couldn't share a screen. I'm stuck in 40 trying to figure out, how to get some more stuff done. So that's going to be a balancing act even for me, I think.
Joyce?
Yeah, I agree. It's all going to be about being flexible. And we've hired great talent, and we need to trust them and empower them to, focus on the goals that we have. And it's not about, were you sitting in front of your computer 8 to 5 answering emails and being on calls, right? I mean, like Andy mentioned, during the pandemic, I think people worked more than 8 hours a day consistently because, you get up and you walk to your laptop and then all of a sudden you're sucked in, right? And it's 6 o'clock and you're not quite sure what happened to the day. And so I think, it's really balancing and making sure that employees know to take that time and to get a break and to go outside. And the same thing is true, when they come into the office. It's, if it's, as long as they don't need to be on a team call, between 8 and 9, and they want to wait for the commute to die down and come to the office at 9:30, as long as you're doing your job and being available to your team members when they need it, we're going to try to be as flexible as possible and make sure that we meet customer expectations and team expectations. So, and it's about trusting your employees,
Well, Natalie, I'll ask you a part B as we wind this down. There are also some legal considerations, I suppose, in what you expect of your employees, depending on the level of employee or what their role is, to be available outside of standard hours and to be responsive to emails and so forth. You want to comment on that briefly before we close out?
Yeah, just really quickly, it comes down to whether or not you're dealing with employees that are considered exempt or non-exempt under the law. So most of the professionals in that higher level, you're going to have exempt. And so they've been doing this already, even if they've been coming to the office. They're focused on getting their job done, not punching a clock or how many hours they're putting in. But when you're dealing with the non-exempt employees working remotely, it gets a lot harder to figure out what is actual work time and how to track that, and making sure that they're getting paid for all of the hours that they're actually working. And I think we're going to have some good policies in place and some good tools in place to track that time for the non-exempt employees, or we're going to see a lot of wage and hour claims.
Yeah, all these things do raise, you've mentioned the legal issue of people being in other states where you might not have had a business presence before. You've got to be clear on which employees you can ask to be more available outside of standard hours than you might have thought about before. So definitely a lot of considerations there. Well, we're basically at the end of our time, perfect timing. I want to thank all of you for making the time to be part of our discussion today, both as panelists, all of our audience, and Dennis, you and Stearns Financial for sponsoring this special offering, this sort of three-parter. Reminder that we'll be sending out a link to a video of today's session, as well as a link to the poll results, which you can find right now at nctech.org/pulse. A reminder that one of the questions in the poll did have to do with the potential public expenditure for expanded rollout of broadband and what that might look like, both in dollars and where and how that might impact the work with business partners to effect that change and so forth. And so the governor's office will be briefing our members tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, live, 8 to 9. We'll have the CIO of North Carolina, the head of the Pandemic Recovery Office within the governor's office, the head of the state's broadband office, and the chief of staff and legislative liaison for the Department of IT, excuse me, all on board tomorrow to share about that. That's a member-only gathering. You can go to our website at nctech.org/events. You'll find it there, and registration is free for our members. So with that, we are adjourned. Have a great rest of your day.